Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eli, and I'm the communications strategist for the climate team. As we wait for others to join, please feel free to share the following in the chat: your name, pronouns, and organization if you're representing one, and what brings you to today's event. Thank you. And organization if you're representing one, and what brings you to today's event. Thank you. And organization if you're For those of you just joining us, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eli. I'm the communication strategist for the climate team. And as we wait just one more minute, please feel free to share the following in the chat: your name, pronouns, organization if you're representing one, and what brings you to today's event. As a reminder, this is being recorded, and Wayne Grabowski is providing technical support, so feel free to direct message them at any time if you're experiencing difficulties. Thank you.
Great. I think it looks like we have some critical mass. Should I get us started? Well, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased to have you here for our third climate conversation. I'm Andrea Jacob. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the climate program manager here at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And I am joined by my climate colleagues. All of us have BPS as the first letters of our screen name. And if everyone could just give a wave. Some of them have the background of our building from at Vanport, where we work. So today we are all here to review our one-year progress on the Climate Emergency Work Plan. Our agenda is going to be dropped in the chat momentarily, but essentially I'm going to give an overview of the Climate Emergency Work Plan and our progress, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper into two of our signature actions, and we'll have time for questions and answers after each of the presentations, and then we'll wrap up with what's next and a quick survey. So just waiting for the presentation to launch. There we go. So on the next slide, please. So the Climate Emergency Work Plan was adopted by City Council last August 2022. It is the city's current climate action plan. And it was laid out by 10 city bureaus to reduce carbon and make Portlanders more resilient to climate change. It includes 47 priority actions to complete or substantially move forward over a 3-year time frame. And roughly half of these actions deal with reducing carbon, while the other half move us towards climate resilience. So those are actions and investments that help our community adapt to the impacts of climate change that we all already know are here. So our intent is to do all of this work through the lens of Portland's core city values of equity, anti-racism, transparency, and collaboration. Our work must respond to the reality that it's our most vulnerable populations, our houseless community, low-income folks, elders, and others that live in isolation, and our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities that are impacted first and worst. So our solutions must lead with justice and center people on the front lines of climate change. So next slide, please. So in terms of progress, one of the standard ways that cities measure and report progress on climate is by tracking community-wide carbon emissions. And Portland has been doing this since 1990. So you see that at the far left of this graphic. And this visual shows a few important things. First of all, it shows our carbon reduction targets. So that red dot at 2030 and those red circles at 2050 represent the goals that we're aiming for. So by 2030, we need to reduce carbon emissions 50% over our 1990 baseline. And by 2050, we have to reach a state of what we call net zero carbon. And the best analogy I heard for this recently came from a conference I was at this week, where they used the image of a bathtub that is really full to the top and water still pouring in from the faucet. So reducing carbon means we've got to turn the water off at the tap, but we still have a really full bathtub and we've got to empty and drain the bathtub. And when we have an empty bathtub, that's net zero carbon. So we can go into that in questions later, but I hope that image is helpful. So the second thing that this chart shows is that between 2000 and 2010, we reduced community-wide carbon emissions substantially. And at the same time, we were welcoming more people and more jobs. So at that time, we had a really great story about how you can grow your economy and have a thriving, prosperous city and still reduce carbon emissions. But the third message is that things have changed since then. That's what the red slope line there is showing, that over time, the rate of reduction since 2010 has really plateaued. And when you compare that from where we are to where we need to go, you can see that our current trajectory is not on course to meet those goals. And our transportation emissions are part of that story, and you're going to hear Ingrid speak about that in a little bit. So currently, our emissions are 21% below our 1990 baseline. And that's great, but it's still not, we still have to get like another roughly 30% in the next 6 years. Next slide, please. So about the progress report, it is, I think we were, despite the fact that carbon emissions are not yet declining, there was a lot of important progress that we made. And together, the Bureau's work to advance 43 of the 47 actions we consider on track to either be completed or to be substantially moved forward by the end of the 2025 period that the Climate Emergency Work Plan covers. So we've done some solid foundational work, and that a lot of that work will yield carbon emission reductions in the future. So 2 of our actions have been achieved. Both of those dealt with the transportation sector emissions, and one of which Ingrid is going to talk about in more depth. The one that we're not going to talk about is the renewable fuel standard that council passed last year, and that addresses diesel emissions, which is our 4th largest source of emissions, and that will have a measurable impact on our carbon emissions at full implementation, which happens in 2030. So the basic themes of the progress report were progress on transportation decarbonization, resilience. We did make Portland more resilient through investments in capital infrastructure projects, more resilient to extreme flooding and heat events. And a lot of these investments were directed at East Portland, which fulfills our equity and anti-racism goals, given the historic disinvestment in East Portland. But the final thing I want to leave you all with before I hand it off to Ingrid is that if we don't mobilize to reduce carbon emissions, our attempts to become a resilient and adaptive community become increasingly more difficult and expensive. So the work of the BPS climate team really does focus on that decarbonization work, while many other people at the city definitely do work related to climate change and climate resilience. Our shop is really focused on that turning off the faucet. So Ingrid, take it away.
Thank you, Andrea. Again, my name is Ingrid Fish, and I work for BPS on the climate team, and I do transportation decarbonization policy. So I'm here to talk about our EV Ready code update, but before I get into it, we have a poll question to ask you to kind of get a sense as to where you are in the audience with this topic. Eli is gonna, or Wing or Eli are going to pop that up. There you go. Okay, and so this question is, do you currently own or use one or more electric vehicles? And that includes electric cars, electric scooters, electric bikes, electric motorcycles, etc. And then the answers are yes, no, or not yet, but I plan to buy or use one in the future. So if you could go ahead and answer that question, we can kind of look to see where folks are on this in the audience. And I think, yeah, we'll just wait. So Eli, mine doesn't indicate that anyone has answered. Do you see that?
Yes, so it looks like we have quite a few answered. If anyone is in the process of answering, please log that in, and then we will end the poll in just 1 second.
Okay.
So you should see the results on your screen now.
Great. So it looks like 46% of us we currently own or currently use an electric vehicle, 21% no, and then 32% not yet, but I plan to buy or use one in the future, which is really encouraging. And it looks like this action that I'm going to talk about may apply to many of us in the future, depending on our living situation. So I am going to talk about our action number T6 in the Climate Emergency Work Plan, which is to adopt EV Ready codes. And it reads as make new construction ready for electric vehicle charging. And this is really kind of a foundational, nationally acknowledged foundational action that really is needed to support the uptake of electric vehicles. So I will get into kind of what EV Ready means in the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. So the definition of what EV Ready infrastructure means was defined by the state of Oregon. And what it means is providing conduit and space on site for electrical capacity to support at least a level 2 EV charger. And a level 2 EV charger are kind of the medium speed chargers that most people have at home and typically charge a vehicle within 3 to 8 hours. So in regular speak, a conduit just means pipes, and space for electrical capacity means space on the panel for future electrical capacity. So this requirement applies to multifamily, and it's currently in effect, and we're happy to have completed it. And the requirement applies to multifamily residential and mixed-use developments with 5 or more new dwelling units that include parking spaces. So for these types of buildings, we are now required to provide electric vehicle ready infrastructure for 50% of parking spaces when the development has more than 6 spaces, and 100% of parking spaces when a development has 6 or few spaces provided. So just to clarify, the developers are not required to provide parking. And when parking is not provided, this requirement does not apply. Developers are also not required to include electrical capacity. They're not required to include electrical outlets or the actual EV chargers as part of this code change. And then with regards to commercial developments, developers need to defer to the state baseline, which is a requirement to install EV ready infrastructure at 20% of parking spaces. Next slide. So why is this important? Transportation is actually responsible for a very large part of our overall carbon emissions in Multnomah County. You can see by this image that it's 44% here in Multnomah County. And in Portland, emissions from buildings and industry have declined 35% since Portland began tracking emissions in 1990. But in contrast, the transportation sector emissions have increased, climbing 3% over 1990 levels. Much of this is due to Portland's growing population, but the point here is, unlike other sectors in Portland, transportation-related emissions are going in the wrong direction. So a key strategy to reducing our emissions in the transportation sector is to transition from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. And in order to drive electric, we need charging stations to be accessible in convenient locations, such as where people live. In addition to transitioning to EVs and zero emission vehicles, we are working to make it easier for people to walk, bike, take public transit, and we're also working to build connected communities where people live close to services, so vehicles and cars are not needed to get to where we need to go. This is all captured in other climate emergency work plan actions under the transportation and land use sections. Next slide. So a little bit of information about what this process looked like and how we got to adoption. It actually took a few years to develop this EV Ready code requirement. And that the reason why is because it involved addressing the state preemption issue, which prevented the city from being able to require developers to install a higher amount of EV charging infrastructure in buildings. So that needed to be addressed. And at the same time as we were working to address that, we were having conversations with community members and EV stakeholders about how to increase EV access to renters. And this systemic approach to require developers to install EV infrastructure was identified in that process. We then asked many of those same stakeholders to give us input on EV Ready code concepts. And community organizations such as Verde, Imagine Black, Hacienda CDC, and Portland Tenants United were included in those conversations. We then received public input on the draft code update and received a recommendation from the Planning and Sustainability Commission, and the requirement was unanimously approved by Council in February of this year. And it went into effect on March 31st. Next slide. So lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about why this matters in the bigger picture. First, transitioning to EVs benefits the climate by reducing carbon emissions, and it also has significant air quality benefits. And up until this point, charging has really been inequitably deployed. The private sector, we're seeing the private sector EV installations typically happen in higher income areas. And this requirement moves us closer to giving those living in multifamily buildings better access to EVs. It's also much less expensive to install EV-ready infrastructure at the time of construction rather than during retrofits after the project is built. And then finally, states are setting goals to phase out the sale of internal combustion engines or gas vehicles. And Oregon has committed to all new vehicle sales being zero emission by 2035. So in order to meet that goal, we need to have EV charging stations to fuel these vehicles, and preferably have them in places where people live because it's the most convenient place to charge. And that is the end of my slide deck.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And with
Thanks.
that, we will have a time of question and answer. I see that there is one question from Brian Romer in the chat. What impact of the CEP do you see from today's decision by FERC approving the GTN Express frac gas expansion in Oregon? So I don't know if someone on the team wants to be able to answer that. If you do have a question, feel free to put it into the chat or to raise your hand and we will go through that.
Let's put a pin in that one and focus on the transportation questions if there are any for Ingrid. Okay, seeing none. Let's see, I can see the chat. So in the slides, but I just, Brian, we're not tracking that. I'm sorry, all that closely. It's bad news, clearly. I don't know what the direct impact on our emissions would be. I mean, certainly the more infrastructure we build, the harder it is to transition off fossil fuels. So I see that all of the senators from the Northwest, I just quickly Googled it, the governor, everyone was opposed to it. FERC did it anyway. Not good news, but aside from that, I'm not going to speculate. Ingrid, looks like there's a question about ADA access.
Yep, so our EV ready requirement did not address ADA specifically because our developers defer to state and federal requirements for EV ready for ADA access. But if I'm asked, I do refer them to this the guide that you just it's the recommendations for accessible EV charging stations. We do refer people to this guide because it's actually pretty thorough and has really good recommendations. Thanks for the question, Robin.
Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hands or to drop it in the chat. We'll give it just another minute and then we'll move to the next presentation. Okay. If you do have any questions that pop up, oh, there is one from Zach Carl. Are there
there's one
plans
about hydrogen fuel cell and vehicles? And I think, so are there plans to seek new federal investments in hydrogen fuel cell and vehicles? Paul Hawkins, feel free to jump in here as well. From city fleet perspective, we aren't really doing hydrogen fuel cell at this point. Kind of citywide, we haven't, and statewide, we haven't invested as much in hydrogen fuel cell as they have, say, in California. So I think we're still kind of in the exploration stage of trying to understand the benefits of and pros and cons of hydrogen fuel cell. Paul, do you want to add anything?
Paul's not here today. He's on.
Oh, Paul's not here. Okay. Or Pam.
I would just say that City Fleet's actively, watching the technology, but our focus on City Fleet is electrifying as many light duty and sedan vehicles as quickly as we can. But we are paying attention, or I should say the City Fleet Department's paying close attention to hydrogen.
I think the only other thing I would add to this, not so much specific to fuel cell vehicles, I don't know that much about that. Our transportation folks answered, but Eric has his hand raised, but just noting that the Biden administration just made $1 billion investment in the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub. It'll be located in Washington. Sunrisa knows a little bit about that if we have further questions. But so hydrogen is definitely a emerging technology area that a lot of federal investment is being directed at. And we will see some of that here in the Northwest.
And the charging infrastructure for hydrogen fuel cell is extremely expensive. So that's a barrier as well at this point. Eric Hessa, did you want to add?
Sorry, I'm glad Andrea. Hi, Eric Hessa with the Portland Bureau of Transportation. So I think glad that Andrea mentioned that investment, which may have also prompted the question there, since that is maybe more infrastructure in the area. And at risk of speaking for a different agency, I'll just say I know from recent conversations that TriMet is looking at the possibility of how hydrogen fits into their zero emission transition, particularly for longer haul routes that they're finding the current electric charging infrastructure and technology is a little bit challenging for. So just that's one place where in the heavier duty space, there is some active consideration I wanted to share.
Thanks, Eric, and everyone for your great questions. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sonrisa. If you do have questions that come up on Ingrid's presentation or on Sonrisa's, please add it to the chat or save it for our next Q&A little session. Sonrisa, take it away.
Thanks, Eli. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Sonrisa Cooper. I use she, her pronouns, and my position on the climate team is Sustainable Economy and Just Transition Analyst. So I work at the intersection of climate action, equity, and economic development. And in a nutshell, my job is really to ensure that all of our work on the climate team creates meaningful benefits for people at the front lines of the climate crisis. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Clean Industry Initiative. This is the newest addition to our decarbonization portfolio, and it's also the core of our Just Transition strategy. Clean Industry is action I1 in the Climate Emergency Work Plan. The goal of this action item is to develop strategies for the industrial sector to reduce emissions, pollution, and waste, and to follow inclusive practices. But before I get into the actual presentation, I wanted to take a little poll as well. Wayne, can you put up the poll question? Yeah, so the question I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on is, what environmental strategy for Portland's industrial sector matters the most to you? Manufacturing parts for clean energy infrastructure, clean energy jobs for underrepresented workers, new green products and markets, reduction of carbon emissions, and reduction of air pollution.
Got a lot of results coming in. And give it just another couple of seconds, and then I will end the poll and share the results.
Okay, so I'm seeing about half of the people voted for reduction of carbon emissions, followed by clean energy jobs for underrepresented workers, air pollution, making parts for clean energy infrastructure, and then new green products and markets. So this was actually kind of a trick question because all of these are part of the Clean Industry Initiative, and there are other things too that I couldn't add more than 5 poll options. So you'll hear more about that in a second, but this is helpful for me to know kind of where people's interests lie before I talk about this. So thanks for voting, everybody. You can move on to the next slide, please. Thanks. So earlier in this presentation, you heard about the goal to slash greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and to reach net zero carbon by 2050. This graphic on the left shows the emissions reductions we can expect if we implemented all the policies in the Climate Emergency Work Plan. And you'll see industry circled at the bottom. We don't really expect any major reductions from industry until at least 2030. And that's because the industrial sector is especially hard to decarbonize. It's because of the cost of the technology. Technology is not widely available yet, and there are a lot of other political and economic factors at play. So we recognize all of these challenges, and so we've developed 4 main goals for the Clean Industry Initiative in light of that situation. The first is to assist Portland's industrial sector in addressing greenhouse gas emissions, as I mentioned, as well as toxic air pollution and waste. The second is to foster industrial climate tech innovation in Portland. This is also an economic initiative. You know, Portland has an excellent history and market for green products and technologies that will help us manage the climate crisis, like manufacturing clean energy components or software. Prosper Portland, which is our economic development bureau, is very involved in the Clean Industry Initiative and recently named climate innovation as a core economic development strategy for Portland's growth and prosperity. The third goal is to identify local policy and/or funding pathways to support clean industry. You know, we've been working with industrial businesses for the last few years to understand what exactly is needed and what is also feasible in terms of policy. And then the fourth is to create opportunities for frontline workers and communities in the emerging clean economy. We embed climate justice principles into all of our work, and this project is aligned with our climate justice mission and strategy. I want to note that these goals aren't about helping specific businesses or working on specific projects, but they're really about making systemic changes across our industrial sector that help us meet our climate goals and also support businesses that are really important to our community. Next slide, please. Earlier this year, we completed a study to understand the current conditions in our industrial sector related to carbon emissions, air pollution, waste, and equity and inclusion. The study also included a scan of global clean industry models and an analysis of policy and finance tools for industry. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but this shows what we were actually looking at in the study. So we identified 4 different subsectors of industry: food and beverage, metals and machinery, electronics, and miscellaneous manufacturing. We also included hospitals and universities because they have significant opportunities for decarbonization and circularity. And we included waste management. You see it at the bottom going across all of them because it is an industrial subsector on its own, and it's also a system that impacts all of the sectors above. That miscellaneous category covers types of manufacturing that don't fall into those other 3 categories. So those are businesses like apparel and textiles, wood, plastics, chemical manufacturing. It's kind of a mix of smaller sub-industries. Our consultants conducted a literature review. They did a survey of industrial businesses, conducted focus groups with all of these categories of businesses, and they also did one-on-one interviews with industrial businesses and utility companies to understand their challenges. In total, we contacted over 1,400 businesses for this study. Next slide. So again, I know there's a lot of information on this slide too, but I think it's a really valuable summary of our findings. So it's very helpful for comparing across the different types of manufacturing, which you can see over on the left side of the graphic. And then across the top, you can see we're able to compare across the number of employees, the total production, which is calculated in wages, greenhouse gas emissions, hazardous air pollution, and the amount of waste generated. So when we're considering putting together a new policy or program for clean industry, this helps us know where we should be targeting our resources. I want to call your attention to food and beverage, which is the green bar by the top, and metals and machinery, which is that orange bar second from the bottom. Compared to the other categories, these have particularly high greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, and waste. So these rose to the top as priority areas for us to focus on in terms of their environmental impact. And these are also sectors that are very important to our local economy. You know, our city identity is really tied to our food and beverage industry here. And we've also had metals manufacturers in Portland for over a century. So it's important for us to understand these sectors better than before. Hospitals and the universities generate relatively low greenhouse gas and air pollution. But they have by far the most employees and generate quite a bit of waste. So in this sector, we should be focusing on equity and workforce development and looking for opportunities for circularity and waste reduction. The miscellaneous category is that big gray bar, and that covers a lot of smaller sub-industries that tend to have much lower employment, but still generate significant greenhouse gas, air pollution, and waste. This grouping of sub-industries has diverse needs when it comes to decarbonization because they're all pretty different. So we need to do more exploration to understand how we can help those types of businesses. Next slide. So next steps over the coming year are first and foremost to implement recommendations from the Clean Industry Study. The top priorities for us are food and beverage manufacturing, strategies to manage industrial heat, which is especially prominent in the metals sector, and looking for pilot projects for something called industrial symbiosis, which is a resource efficiency approach for industry. We're also partnering with Portland State University and other stakeholders to go after funding to implement these recommendations and do additional research. And finally, it's important to mention the Inflation Reduction Act, which will be a major factor in our ability to meet the goals. Industrial decarbonization and innovation have come out as a high priority for the Biden administration. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to access federal funds to carry out this work. Next slide. So if we do this right, we'll not only meet our carbon reduction net zero goal, but also have the added benefit of reduced air pollution and waste from the industrial sector. Long-term, we hope that this helps create a strong local ecosystem for clean manufacturing. Portland has always had an active industrial sector for as long as we've existed as a city. And so this is really the time to help industry meet the challenge of a cleaner future and be resilient to a changing economy. We want to help develop some pilot projects demonstrating that Portland can be a laboratory for industrial innovation. We see this as an opportunity to solve some pretty unique problems and continue our position as a city that is at the forefront of global climate action. And finally, I said this at the beginning of my presentation, but the Clean Industry Initiative is at the core of our Just Transition strategy. We recognize that the legacy of manufacturing in Portland's history. It is a sector that employs a high proportion of BIPOC workers and pays good family wages to people that don't have college degrees. So as the industrial sector transitions to a cleaner future, we're committed to making sure that it remains a place of opportunity for workers and communities at the front lines of climate change. That's my presentation. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed learning about the Clean Industry Initiative.
Thanks so much, Sonersa. And with that, I'll open it up for questions and comments. If you have any to add or to share, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat. I see, Babs, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, first I want to say I am overwhelmed trying to take in all this information, but clearly your team is making progress. I took pictures of several of the slides so I can share those. Thank you. I did just see that Brian Romer put a question in about how citizens can help. I would also have that question. My other question, though, was about Portland State University's involvement. Will that be through a specific research team, or how will PSU be involved? Thank you.
Thanks, Babs, sorry about that. I appreciate the kind words. To answer your question about Portland State University, we are partnering with the Institute for Sustainable Studies, I think ISS, I think that's what it stands for. We've partnered with them in the past, and they are going to be helping us with federal grant applications, as well as any other sort of research funding that they can go after. And we are also expecting to probably pull in some other university partners. We just don't have enough capacity at the city to apply for every single federal grant that's out there. There's a lot of funding, and the process of applying for federal funding is pretty onerous and time consuming. So they'll be supporting us with that. And we have a team of, I think it's 3 or 4 folks over there that are involved in this work.
And I guess I'll start us off on answering Brian's question. It's interesting that you frame it that way, because I think how we've been thinking about it is, how can the city help citizens access IRA funds? A lot of it is intended to go directly into the hands of consumers and building owners and things like that. For the city accessing funds, I think a lot of the infrastructure bureaus that could benefit from the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is really an infrastructure focused funding source, and Inflation Reduction Act, those bureaus are really looking at those opportunities, and different bureaus have different levels of capacity to do that. So I don't know if Eric, maybe do you want to answer on behalf of PBOT? I don't know if we have any other city staff. So it really has to be led, because of the complexity of the federal applications. It does have to, those types of applications need to be led by the bureaus that would be receiving the funds directly.
Yeah, no, I think I'll validate that, Andrea. There are certainly eligibility requirements in many of these, some of which might be able to support sort of community-based activity in the end. You know, I think in some ways I might point also back to Portland Clean Energy Fund and the work there that's very much community focused, that might be sort of an easier place for the Portland region to focus on some of those opportunities. Though I'll also just note, I guess there are the climate pollution reduction grant programs the EPA has out now that does have some opportunity for coalitions that are both public and private, if you will, to participate in that, though that sort of process regionally is just starting and being led by Metro as well. So can't speak to that too much right now, but those are a few of those ways that might happen. And then overall, I think to the extent that these community conversations can lift up priorities and ideas from community that city staff can then help move ahead with and try to go after appropriate funds, that's another way in which I think that dynamic could work, Brian. So appreciate you asking.
So I think Jenny's question is next. Yes, this is a great question. So there are folks at BPS on this team. We are the ones charged with reporting to council every year on the annual progress. So the progress report that we've been referring to throughout this presentation was delivered to council in July. And in order to do that, we had a multi-person team at BPS working with a multi-stakeholder group across the city. And I guess I'd like to turn it over to Pam to talk a little bit about that process, since she really ran that. And we will be doing some version of that over the next couple of years too.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. The process itself was, like Andrea said, run by a few staff here at BPS. Andrea and Tunde and Eli and myself were the primary staffers running the process. And really it was a lot of information gathering. So many of the actions that you see on the climate emergency work plan are run at different bureaus other than BPS. And so we worked with primary contacts in those bureaus, who then went out and talked to the staff who are actually implementing the work. And we asked specific questions around their resource, either needs or gaps and barriers in resources. We also asked questions around, obviously, like Andrea showed the pie chart, whether they were on track, those actions were delayed or completed. And then because this is a 3-year work plan and we're right in the middle of it, we tried to focus specifically on the work that had been done in the previous calendar year. So I think what you'll see from BPS in this upcoming year is something very similar to what you're seeing now through the climate emergency work plan, because this work plan only lasts through 2025. And I believe Andrea's going to wrap up the presentation today, talking to you a little bit about what's coming and what's next in terms of kind of engaging on the climate emergency work plan and what comes after our 2025 year kind of sunsets the existing plan.
Awesome. Thanks, Pam. So are there dollars in the, so I think when people are saying climate emergency work plan, yes, set aside for green work. So the climate emergency work plan is not funded itself, the projects. And so what you see in the plan is actually, there's a column for resource gaps. So some of those action items have adequate funding, and many more of them identify a gap that would need to be filled. And we would have those conversations about funding when each of those projects or programs or policies would go to council. That was the intent of the climate emergency work plan. Like, there are hundreds of actions community-wide that can be done on climate. The climate emergency work plan focuses really on what the city government, specifically Portland City Council in its current incarnation, could do. When we wrote it a year and a half ago or whatever it was now, it was really aimed to kind of highlight council's specific role, and recognizing that we don't have all the funding that we need, but wanting to give a platform for indicating that as these different items come before council for consideration, that funding is a huge part of that conversation. And so that it's not that this came with an allocation of funding. It was sort of the vehicle to tell the story of, we're going to come to you and ask for funding, and this is why. So that sort of gets it. And Sonrisa, please feel free.
Yeah, I do want to add that most of the IRA funds, probably most of them have workforce development and training kind of requirements attached to them. I know if you receive a tax credit through the IRA, it has a multiplier if you include if you meet certain labor standards. And of course, there's Justice 40, which requires that 40% of the investments go to disadvantaged communities. And a lot of that comes through in the workforce development pieces of it. Also in the PSEF, of course, has a very strong workforce development component to it and funds those kinds of projects, which you'll see in the climate investment plan that just came out.
And can I just add to that, Sonrisa, that in the PSEF's climate investment plan, there's $11.8 million allocated to go to workforce development over the next 5 years. So that's a pretty significant amount.
We could have a whole presentation on the Inflation Reduction Act and the other and the bipartisan infrastructure law. I just spent 2 days at a conference with federal government and state government talking all about this, and it's really complicated. But the whole intent is to make sure that the benefits from these investments are flowing to people. That was reiterated over and over again. So even if it's for and that's mainly for the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not sure about the IIJA or bill, like Eric, if PBOT's applying for infrastructure. I mean, the Justice 40 still applies to that as well, right? So theoretically, every investment that we're making, every application that we're looking for money for will have those, it's a compliance requirement, like it has to. It isn't really optional. Okay, so I am going to switch gears and talk, if we're done, let's just check in and if there are any other questions on the content we've presented, because I am going to talk a little bit about PSEF, and we're going to have more opportunity here about that. Should move on. Okay, so 2 things that I wanted to mention as we wrap up that are important on the horizon for climate, not necessarily programmatic to what this team does in and out, day in, day out, but very important for climate in our community and really worth mentioning. So the first is the Sustainability and Climate Commission. So this is under the direction and leadership of our commissioner in charge, Commissioner Carmen Rubio, and again, in the current council formation. We are in the midst of standing up a new commission to serve as a key accountability body for the climate in all city business. So the SCC, as it's called, will act as a bridge between boards, commissions, elected officials, staff, and the community, both internally to the city and with our many partners. And ultimately, we hope it will serve as a decision-making body for city projects, programs, and policies that could have an impact on our climate. So for example, I think what Pam was alluding to is that our after the climate emergency work plan kind of goes through its life through 2025, we're hopeful that the Sustainability and Climate Commission will be the chief sponsor and leader of Portland's next climate action plan. So the public involvement process has already begun for the commission, and we anticipate city council to weigh in by the end of the year. There is currently an open survey to gather community input for the formation of the Sustainability and Climate Commission. That was just dropped in the chat. So I encourage folks who have an interest in this to go ahead and take a look at that survey and let us know your thoughts about this really new important body, which has been missing from the Portland landscape for quite some time. So we're all pretty excited about the formation of this body and hopeful that it raises the profile and elevates some leadership for climate in our community. So, and then the last thing I wanted to really highlight was the Portland Clean Energy Fund, or Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund, or PCEF. It has a lot of names. Many of you know about this and read about this in our local press. So PCEF is also housed at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. It's a sister program to what we do on the BPS climate team. You think of us as sort of a program and policy and research shop. PCEF is really the investment arm around climate, and really working to with a climate justice lens. So they recently published the Climate Investment Plan. That's a 5-year roadmap to climate action and a really pivotal step in advancing a climate resilient Portland. So the Climate Investment Plan crosswalks to and supports the city's climate emergency work plan and our net zero carbon emissions goals. It prioritizes frontline communities, including low-income populations, communities of color, and people experiencing disabilities. And because it's such a broad, wide-ranging, deep program, we decided that they should be the feature of our next climate conversation. So they will be, that date is still TBD, but sometime in the first quarter of 2024, Climate Conversation 4 will be about PCEF. So that one will be interesting, and hopefully we'll be able to hear from some of their direct grantees too. I'm not sure about that, but that would be really cool. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Eli. So we can do, or I guess we can take a few questions if there are questions about SCC or PCEF in the short term. But if not, Eli can take it away.
If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat. Well, we have a few questions for you. So these conversations are really effective when we have input from the community and from those who are interested in connecting with us, learning with us, and engaging with us. And so we have just a few questions. It should take about 2 to 3 minutes to answer 6 questions, very simple. But it'll help shape future events and help us inform the content for those. So I'm dropping that in the chat. If you wouldn't mind to take just a couple of minutes and fill that out and let us know what worked, what didn't work, what you want to know more about. And that way we can shape these. And then I will also add that there's a way to get informed about future events. And I will find that link and drop that in the chat as well, so you can sign up for those emails and be aware of future events.
I've got that if you don't, Eli.
Thanks, Wing. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any other hands raised or any other questions in the chat. If you do have a question at any time, feel free to find our contact information on the website and reach out to us. And we want to stay engaged and connected with you as a community. And with that, I will close this meeting and thank you all for coming and participating, asking questions, and engaging with us.